scholars and professional journalists around pressing topics and questions. We may not be able to meet on campus today, but as a community, we continue to connect with each other, to collaborate, to discuss the work our faculty and students are undertaking and the impact Columbia is making even in these trying times. For more information on all the exciting events and courses at Columbia this summer, please visit summer.sps.columbia.edu. Tonight's conversation will be moderated by multi-Emmy award-winning journalist and documentary filmmaker, Professor June Cross. Professor Cross teaches journalism here at Columbia's School of Journalism, where she's also director of the documentary journalism program. Her own work covers the intersection of poverty, race, and politics in the United States. She's a professor of journalism here at our Graduate School of Journalism, where she founded the documentary program. Her own documentary work includes Wilhelmina's War, a documentary about women caring for those living with HIV in South Carolina, and The Old Man in the Storm, which followed the extended New Orleans family as they struggled to rebuild their homes after Hurricane Katrina. She's joined by Christia Mercer, who is the Gustav M. Byrne Professor of Philosophy at Columbia, and Professor Melvin Rogers, who teaches political science at Brown University. Now I'll hand this over to June Cross, so you might hear about the reasons for rethinking the whole history of Western thought. Professor Cross?
Thank you, Steve. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm really honored to be joined tonight by, is my video off? Hold on. The host has asked me to start my video. I apologize. I thought it was on. Hi there. Hello again. Welcome to Zoom land. I'm really honored to be joined tonight by Christia Mercer and Melvin Rogers, who together are editing a series of histories of philosophy called the Oxford New Histories of Philosophy. They are the series editors, and they've been really exploring how diverse voices that are otherwise not really thought about within the philosophical canon, what they can bring to that canon and how we can in turn reimagine that history and reimagine our present within the context of that history. Professor Rogers is an associate professor of political science at Brown. Professor Mercer is a professor of philosophy here at Columbia. I wanted to start, I was just going to jump in because you both have really distinguished resumes, and those who want to know more about you can find you through your faculty bios of your respective institutions and on our website. But when we were talking about how to sort of begin this conversation, we were talking about this idea of feeling our way to truth. Can you each, Melvin, maybe you could start and talk about what that means for you within the context of the events of 2020?
Yeah, sure. So first, let me just say, June, it's an honor to be here with you, and it's an honor to be here with Christia, and to talk about the series. So this question of feeling our way to truth is a pretty complicated theme. But I think if we begin from the perspective of our present moment, the protests that are taking place right now, what we see in the streets at this very moment is an expression of anger, right? An expression of anger given the sort of persistent devaluation of Black life, right? And there's a way in which we often think about anger as taking place precisely at the moment when reason has been suspended. And yet, what I think is quite striking about this moment is that anger actually is an expression that something has happened. And in this particular context, right, that an injustice has taken place. And the relationship, I think, between that present moment and some of what we're doing in this series is that, at least on the side of African-American moral and political philosophy, the emotions, anger has been quite central to the development of that tradition, and has been quite central in helping to reveal to readers, listeners, right? That a grave injustice has taken place, and a way of directing our attention to the reality that is on display. And so this is sort of my take on how I think Christia and I understand this idea of feeling one's way to truth.
Christia, you've done a lot of work, or increasingly been doing work with incarcerated persons. How can you talk about the role of suffering within the regards to sort of feeling our way to truth in the context of philosophy?
Yeah, no, thank you I mean, I think that's been a really important part of my life, by the way, in recent years. And I do think there's some fundamental philosophical insights I've had from doing that. So actually, one thing that's quite relevant to what Melvin just said is something like the following. I mean, I've taught in a women's prison, Taconic Correctional Facility, and recently developed a program in the Metropolitan Detention Center, which is basically a federal Rikers in Brooklyn. And one of the things that's really been striking to me is the extent to which teaching ancient literature, teaching literature that itself treats vivid emotion. So, for example, at Taconic, we taught Antigone. We taught the ancient play Oresteia, which is about death and matricide and fratricide and so on and so forth. And one of the things that's really striking to me about the situation for people who are incarcerated is the extent to which they can't express their anger, to pick up the point about anger, when they're inside. They can't actually express their emotions very vividly, because if they do, they often get in trouble. They're supposed to stay calm and steady in a way. So to give people the opportunity to think through great literature, to kind of work through their emotional imagination, and to come to insights by looking at the way in which great authors in the past have thought about big topics. They've come to some sort of basic understanding sometimes, for example, about justice, about the role of emotion, and so on. So by teaching in prison, I've been even more moved than I already was to think that it's important to not just hear marginalized voices, but also learn from the exchange that they have with one another in class, and the way in which they teach one another about how to think through emotion. So in my philosophical work, I've been quite committed. I have a book project called Feeling the Way to Truth: Women, Reason, and the Development of Modern Philosophy, where the point was partly motivated by working in prison. And the idea there is somehow that there's a lot that we can understand by thinking through emotion, by thinking through feeling, we often think that reason, or the understanding, these faculties that philosophers love to focus on, are the sources of insight, when in fact our feelings are in our thinking through how we respond to the world can bear even more significant insights.
Okay. You've talked to Christia, or you've studied Teresa of Avila, who actually sort of made a spiritual career out of suffering. And Melvin, you've been working on David Walker in particular, an 1820s, 19th century sort of pamphlet. I don't know what the right word to call him. He was an abolitionist, a pamphleteer. I don't know what the proper word is. Who spoke so eloquently to what is going on now. When I read his manifesto, I was thinking, my God, the Black Lives Matter movement could have written this yesterday. Could each of you talk about the relevance of those particular historical figures to what we're enduring now in terms of COVID-19 and police brutality?
Why don't I go first, Melvin, just because Teresa was long before Walker, and Walker is more obviously related. I mean, one of the reasons this idea of this very provocative title is Reason Overrated, is, one of the things that Melvin and I both felt strongly about saying is that we love reason. We're right here using reason, right? Philosophy is based in reason. So we don't want to cast reason away by any stretch of the imagination. But we come to the need to think through feeling the way to truth from somewhat different traditions. So one of the things I'm very interested in and have a paper coming out about, in fact, there was something I published in the Nation magazine last summer about something like the title is something like the philosophical origins of sexism or misogyny, is the way in which reason itself has been often used by people in power to oppress others. And so one of the things that's very striking about Plato, for example, is he says that to be virtuous, you have to abide in reason. And Aristotle says to be virtuous, we are virtuous creatures insofar as we are rational creatures. But then there's this like strange underbelly to this, which is that only powerful men who are educated can develop reason. And one of the things that really interests me is the arguments that were given in the ancient world for the extent to which women are more tied to their bodies. The arguments are really interesting and fascinating, but women cannot fully develop reason. They cannot be full citizens. So we have this tradition then of women not being allowed to be educated. You think of the Gospels. I mean, Paul says, I do not allow women to teach or preach. And so fast forward then, in medieval Europe, it's really striking that there were virtually no women whose texts have survived. So it may be the case that women didn't write, but surely if they did write, we don't know about those texts. But suddenly, and again, the history of this is fascinating, but suddenly people became interested in suffering, and especially the suffering of Christ, and thinking about that as a way of understanding some important truths about morality. And one of the things that's amazing to me is the extent to which women, because they were tied to their bodies, because they were less rational in a way, were supposed to be better at kind of understanding the moral implications, if you want to put it that way, of suffering. So Teresa of Avila was a person who was brilliant at being really rational, by the way. I mean, she did great philosophy, but she also felt her way to truth and talked in very simple terms sometimes about the importance of compassion, of understanding the role of other people in one's life. And one of the things, and we can maybe talk about this later, but one of the things that's amazing about her is I show that Teresa of Avila foresaw many of the arguments in Descartes' Meditations. Descartes supposed to be the great father of modern philosophy. So maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. But the point is this, that reason was used to suppress people. Reason was used to keep a number of people down. And Aristotle talks about natural slaves. But then there became a moment in the history of philosophy that sort of opened the door to people who themselves were powerless to have the opportunity then to think about suffering and to see their connection to the suffering of Christ and the suffering of the saints, for example, so that they can then talk about that, do philosophy on that, and actually have their voices heard. So that's my take on that's the way in which I have been really focusing on how feeling the way to truth opens the way for women and their voices to be heard.
Thank you. So Melvin, during the 19th century, David Walker is writing during a time in which the rule of law says that African Americans are slaves, that they have no reason, no potential for reason. Thomas Jefferson himself has said maybe in 5 generations they may be able to sort of sit at the same table where we're sitting. Can you talk to us a bit about Walker and his importance to the philosophical canon?
Yeah, sure. So I think, perhaps I should, I want to go back to the present moment or stay in the present moment a little bit, because I think that one of the things that is on display at this present moment, which is tied to the devaluation of Black folks, is the way in which the humanity of Black folks, their humanity is rendered invisible, right? And one of the things about the sort of invisibility of the present moment that's sending people into the streets is that it is actually connected to a philosophical story about invisibility. Right? I mean, part of what this series is about, right, is rendering visible that which has been treated or viewed as invisible. And this sort of principle of invisibility is what sort of binds, in some ways, this series to the present moment. The question that emerges when you read someone like David Walker is, how is American moral and political philosophy shifted when you include David Walker's voice? Right, 1829, we get the appeal to the colored citizens of the world, and in particular, but very expressly, of the United States of America. That's the title, right?
Maybe we could show that slide real quick while you're talking. Keep talking.
And he is calling Black folks citizens at the very moment in which their standing as citizens is denied. So it raises a critical question. How are we to conceive of citizenship, right? Because in our sort of discourse in the present moment, we think of citizenship as that which is bestowed on one by virtue of a constitution, right? And one of the things that David Walker is suggesting to us, and it is captured in the word appeal, is that look, by virtue of you judging and thinking about your social and political world, you are by that fact a citizen. In other words, it is actually your capacity to feel and reason that is the hallmark of your citizenly standing, right? And that's what we see on the streets, right? We see ordinary, everyday Black folks. It's a multiracial movement, right? On the streets, saying that the institutional structures that don the cloak of democracy will no longer determine the life chances of folks, right? And things must change, right? And so what people are doing are they're reclaiming that capacity to judge, right? Which is the hallmark, in Walker's sense, is the hallmark of what it means to be a citizen in a Republican society or a Democratic society. Those two are interchangeable.
You know, these are names. I knew both of these names tangentially growing up. I knew David Walker better than Teresa, but can you talk a bit about how you unearth these texts? They're texts that are known well among historians, but how do you find them? What process have you gone through to surface the primary material that you're working with?
Yeah, I really think that my story about how I found Teresa is like a really good example of the goals that Melvin and I are both about. So just, very, very quickly, right, the history of philosophy that most people have learned, 99% of the people who took philosophy over the past 100 years, learned that there's Plato and Aristotle, and there's this gap of the so-called Dark Ages. And then Descartes is the father of modern philosophy and created this special school of the rationalists, and his children, almost like his progeny, Leibniz and Spinoza. And then there's the empirists, and there's this Kant, and the values of the American Revolution and so on were supposed to come out of all of that. And that's the story that we were all taught. That's even the story that we're still, like many students are still taught. I think one of the really important things about this book series is that, in fact, this sort of general project was very much started by my dear friend Eileen O'Neill back in the 90s. Starting in the 90s, a lot of people got interested in marginalized voices. I mean, partly because we just thought it would be important to hear what women had to write or what African Americans from the 19th century had to write. But lo and behold, by kind of looking at them more seriously, it turns out the entire history of philosophy has to be rewritten. So the story about Teresa is really astonishing. I mean, everybody knows that Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. And that's supposed to be the creation of the modern notion of the subjective self. Right. And everybody knows that was kind of set up by this argument, or anybody who's studied the meditation has been taken by the fact that there's supposed to be this evil deceiver who's like, messing with your mind and makes you think that 2 + 4 = 6, but in fact it's 9 or something. So like I like to say sometimes, it's like the evil deceiver was the midwife of the modern self, right? Mm-hmm. And people had noticed that there were meditations written before Descartes, and they thought, well, look, what great man might have been the source for Descartes' meditations? Because, he's awesome and he's like our father, but maybe he had a father too. And they looked around for great men who were the source of his ideas, and they didn't find one, so they left it at that. And it didn't dawn on them that there might be a great woman, right? And the great woman, as it turns out, is Teresa of Avila.
So was she like the Brene Brown of her time? I mean, was she well-read? And
well, she, of course, as a woman, she couldn't be educated. And so she often talks about how lucky she is to get to talk to, wise men. And it was also true that if women were, so it's very interesting, actually, I could rant about this, I'll try to be short, but, had she written a philosophical treatise of the sort that we think philosophers should write, she wouldn't have been published, because the point was still that women were not supposed to do that kind of thing. So she had to write in this kind of quiet, I'm so humble, what do I really know mode. But yet she zaps you with these amazing philosophical ideas. And she creates a notion, she has an evil deceiver that forces you, that actually makes you doubt all of your beliefs about the world. And then you have to look inward. And lo and behold, she has many of the same arguments that are supposed to have been invented by the great man.
Was she read during her time? Was she a
yes, actually, we have a slide here. I will show you the slide. So she wrote in Spanish, and then the frontispiece on the left is a Latin translation of all of her works. She was published into German. I love the English title, The Flaming Heart, or The Life of the Glorious Saint Teresa. So she died. She was canonized very quickly after her death. And my jokey way of putting it is like she was like the Beyonce of the 17th century, in the sense that everybody knew about her, right? Okay. Everybody read her. She would have been well known at Descartes' school. So when he was a boy going to a Jesuit school, the Jesuits loved her and were talking about her constantly. And when he was in Paris writing the Meditations, she was like all the things. She was the most popular author among all of the kind of cool philosophers, so to speak. Right. Some of his best friends, were talking about her constantly. So he must have known her, and he surely knew her ideas, even if he didn't read through them, through her text all that carefully. So she's just a really good example of a woman who just got left out of the history of philosophy. But it turns out not only was herself extremely influential, but actually came up with arguments that we have long attributed to Descartes, on the basis of which we've made him the father of modern philosophy.
Yeah, I think every woman that's ever been in a meeting with guys can relate.
Exactly.
Melvin, how did David Walker's ideas spread during his era? How was he read and perceived during the 1820s?
Right. So I want to say two things, which is connected to Teresa. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that there's a question that emerges in the context of the status of women and in the context of the status of African Americans. How is one to get on about the business of advancing claims about one's intellectual powers, about one's standing, precisely when you're thought not to be rational, and precisely when you can't sort of take your work to the publisher and have it respected, right? And this generates a series of more subtle and clandestine approaches that actually have shaped the different genres in which women and African Americans have communicated their philosophical ideas. I mean, this is one of the reasons why, in the context of African American moral and political thought, the pamphlet, the sermon, the slave narrative, the essay, or the novel sits much higher in the sort of hierarchy of intellectual and philosophical expression than something like the treatise, the philosophical treatise, right? And precisely because there's a way in which a kind of a sort of formalized nature of philosophizing is privilege that we will often find in the treatise, when one turns to the pamphlet or to the novel, one typically says, given the value placed on the treatise, well, that must not be, that can't be philosophy, right? Of course, David Walker, just to be quite clear about this, in some ways, a good number of Black folks didn't especially care. Mm-hmm. What do I mean by that? They weren't interested in philosophical debates, right?
Well, there was no room to have a philosophical debate.
They were interested, right, exactly. They were interested in advancing claims about right, about their sort of political and ethical standing and transforming the society to which they belong. And one can then read off from that, as I do, right, as a sort of contemporary political philosopher, one can read off from that philosophical claims. David Walker, publishing in the 19th century, influenced other figures. That particular slide that was put up earlier of David Walker, Henry Highland Garnett, a philosophical mind in his own right, was influenced by David Walker. Mariah Stewart of the 1830s, who published pretty widely in The Liberator. She was influenced by Walker and knew him. Hosea Easton, excuse me, of the same period of the 1830s, was influenced. Douglas and Du Bois both acknowledged the significance and importance of the pamphlet.
Mm-hmm.
The pamphlet
How were
itself,
these distributed at that period of time?
right? So
Black Americans would have been enslaved. There was no black press. There's no
right. So we do have, we do have Freedom's Journal at this time, right? The first African American newspaper. But Walker's pamphlet, he was in Boston, living in Boston. He had contacts. He would literally send the pamphlet by mail south. It would be sewn into clothes to be smuggled on ships that were heading south. So this is how it found its way in the South. And of course, in the 1820s, and given the period of the 19th century and various slave insurrections and the like, when Walker's pamphlet was discovered, it was taken to be incendiary, right? And so incendiary that places like North Carolina and Georgia sort of passed as sort of anti-literacy laws, right? Or they intensified the ones that they already had. The governor of North Carolina put 10,000 on Walker's head, right? So this is an extraordinary text. And in the context of the text, right, in the pamphlet itself, there's an argument about freedom. There's an argument about rebellion. There's an argument about racial solidarity. The pamphlet itself, Walker says that every man, woman, and child should read it or have it read to them. Every man, woman, and child, right? So there's a story about the status of women, although he doesn't go as far as one would like. That would be picked up by a Stewart, right? So much of what you see in African American political thought after Walker can trace its conceptual origins to this extraordinary pamphlet.
How do the stories of people like Walker and Teresa impact the canon of philosophy? I can hear some straight-laced conservatives saying, these snowflakes, they're just trying to muck up the canon of philosophy again. Everybody knows it's Aristotle, Descartes, Kant, what do we learn when we add these voices in?
So this is so if I can, right, this is the thing about, once again, those protests in the street and this theme of invisibility. Mm-hmm. Philosophy as a field of inquiry can often appear tired and passé. But if you treat philosophy as a means for sort of educating our sensibilities, mm-hmm. all of a sudden these texts open philosophy up, because they're a training in how to perceive more accurately, how to see more widely and feel more deeply about the world and the people to which you are connected. That's the hope of it, right? And so when these texts are included in philosophical discourse, unbeknownst to ourselves, and right subtly, right, they are sort of these texts are educating and enhancing our sensibilities, right? Which, in the context of the kind of society we live in, a democratic society, this becomes all the more important, right? Because we rely on ourselves to engage in the practice of self-governance. And so we depend on each other to properly hear the call, the cry of our fellows, to see the pain of our fellows. And that's what, right, that's what it means, right? That's what's possible, right? If we sort of re-narrate the history of philosophy. It's a possibility, of course, not a certainty, but I'll take a possibility.
Okay. Christia, do you have anything to add to that, or you want to?
Oh, I think
Melvin
just made a really important point very, very well. So not to repeat that, but one of the things, I gave a lecture a few months ago to a bunch of philosophers. It was called Empowering Philosophy. And one of the things that's really striking these days, right, is the humanities are, underfunded. A lot of philosophy departments are being cut. I mean, if we're going to maintain ourselves as philosophers, we need to broaden what we think of as philosophy and embrace, the points that Melvin made. But also as a kind of nerdy historian of philosophy, I spent 15 years of my life working on Leibniz, one of those 17th century rationalists. And one of the things I realized is when you take that bead off the string, if you reject this idea of the history of philosophy is a bunch of one bead and then another bead and another bead, you take Leibniz's bead off the string and you put it into the 17th century and all its messiness. It turns out Leibniz looks very, very different than he did before. And it turns out Leibniz himself was interested in peace. His whole philosophy was in a way an attempt to motivate people to find personal, political, and religious peace. So when we have lots of reasons to rethink the history of philosophy, but even the nerds, even the kind of straight-laced, I like Descartes and Leibniz, even those people have to admit that when you put Descartes next to Teresa, or you put Leibniz in this context of discussion about peace, suddenly our heroes even look really, really different. And just one last point, and I'd love to hear, Melvin, it's always so much fun to talk to Melvin about these things. But one concept that's been used a lot recently by feminists, and especially people who are doing the kind of work of reconsidering notions of power in the 19th and 20th century, and especially the history of African American thought, is a notion I really love, which is pernicious ignorance. You have to really work to make the history of philosophy stay this way, the way it has been. All you have to do is just talk about Walker or talk about Teresa or even reconsider Leibniz. And suddenly there are all these amazing questions, many of which we actually really care about today. So we're not saying throw the canon.
More about that, because we actually have a question from a prospective student, Sophia Diddy, who's actually asking, what is the relevance of philosophy today? How does it underlie our present day decision making, and where do we see it in political ideology of 2020?
Right.
That's a big question. You could probably go for an hour on that.
Start it, and then I'm sure Melvin has a lot to say. But just for example, what is philosophy about today? Philosophers have long been interested in, philosophy was originally the study of wisdom and how to be in the world and how to be, how to get it right, how to get life right. And one problem I've long had about philosophy and the way it's practiced is that there's some very specific questions that are supposed to be philosophical questions, the nature of knowledge or the nature of, of what the metaphysical basis of things are. And those are great problems. I love them actually. I love to work on them. But they're also, if you just start asking about, like Leibniz, for example, what the metaphysics has to do with how you live a life, then it turns out those philosophical questions open up in ways that we often haven't been allowed to go in those directions. And also to Melvin's really important point, it turns out if you think about people doing philosophy in slave narratives or in spiritual meditations, there's a huge amount of philosophy being done there. I bet a lot of people did some philosophy and thinking through the pandemic, right? And so, we open up ourselves.
In what way did people use philosophy in thinking through the pandemic?
Well, I think, I guess maybe I'm not a good test case, but, from moment to moment, we didn't know how horrible things were going to be. We didn't know who we knew and loved were going to die. We didn't know how to be responsible in the world. And one of the things, I love that I've been around for a while now and I've taught a lot of students. And I often get emails from students saying, I never really thought that this question that we talked about in class was going to be so relevant to my life. And here I am, I'm asking questions about how to get life right, or I'm writing my own little meditation on the fact that my grandmother just died. I couldn't tell her goodbye. So I think COVID, the crisis, raised a lot of questions for a lot of people that are fundamentally philosophical. And if we train people a little bit better than we have before, they would feel more comfortable just being philosophers.
Okay. Melvin, how do you answer that question about the relevance of philosophy to modern day events?
Well, in some ways, right? In some ways, I've been going on about it for a good while.
You have.
What we've
But I'm not sure that the people who are running Black Lives Matter even know that there was a David Walker. I may be wrong. I may be.
Well, look. I think that we live, that we live some philosophy every day of our life, right?
In what way?
The practices in which we participate, the choices that we make about the life that we want to live, about our relationship to other human beings, about political choices that we make, right? We live some philosophy, every day, and some kind of philosophy over another kind of philosophy, right? And the question is, do we live it blindly, or do we live it reflectively? I mean, that's the Socratic question, right? But that is the question that runs through the entirety of and here to just sort of focus the Western philosophical tradition, both its visible components and its invisible components, right? But look, Christia raised an important question, that to have philosophy, to have the discipline of philosophy structured as it is, one has to work very hard at it. Mm-hmm. And that of course,
something ignorant, a pernicious ignorance. That was a great phrase. Yeah.
And that raises a sort of dark implication, right, for what it is we're trying to do in opening up philosophy. And we're not the only ones, right? There are a whole series of folks in philosophy that have been trying to sort of open it up in various ways, right? And that of course reveals the ways in which folks are invested in a particular white European version of philosophy, and invested in it as it bears on their identity, right? To the exclusion of those who are not male or who are non-white, right? It carries its own sense of superiority, right? And there's a reproduction of that. And so to open philosophy up is in some sense to democratize it, right? And to put those who have otherwise seen themselves philosophically on a higher plane, on an equal plane, right? And sometimes we might demote them. By that, I only mean demote them insofar as they're in the business of trying to exclude other folks, right? And that is sort of a dangerous thought, right? And so folks won't be running with arms open toward the kind of thing that Christia and I are doing, but Oxford did, and so we appreciate that.
Yeah, and I want to be a little bit optimistic. I mean, I think that, for example, people trained as philosophers really want to be better at what they do. They see their numbers decrease. They realize that a lot of their students is a more diverse student body, and they're poised to do the right thing, to rethink philosophy. And one of the things that we're trying to do in the series is to catch up to that. Right. By making David Walker's text available, I'm working on this is an astonishing story. I'm working on a 17th century woman now, Anne Conway, who has this crazy metaphysics that sounds kind of wild, but it turns out she was actually quite influential. The Quakers, the original American Quakers, were quite moved by her philosophy, and actually she may have motivated some of them to be abolitionists. Like, that's astonishing, right? And so to kind of open up the conversation, so Melvin and I, and again, I always want to signal my dear friend Eileen O'Neill, who unfortunately passed away 2.5 years ago, who kind of got this all going. But we want to make it easier for philosophers to be better at this.
I think you're right. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
You know,
And
one of the things I've been thinking of is like in the present moment when the country is so divided along partisan lines, it almost seems we can't even agree on the history. You guys are, you have common mind, you're working on a history of philosophy. But one of the problems that I think the country faces, certainly I found in my own reporting, is that we cannot agree even on the history. We look at the same set of facts and draw dramatically different conclusions. Do you see a way that philosophy can help us through this thicket of sort of permanent political bias that seems to have entered the country's conversation?
Well, I would just say this. I dare anyone to take one of my philosophy classes
Okay.
and not come out with a kind of critical eye, right? So if you watch Fox News and you learn that the world is A and B, but you notice that the newspaper, even your local newspaper in some cases, say it's not, like, you need to be able to have the tools to analyze that and wonder how can there be a narrative that is being told that other people so fundamentally agree with, and how, you need to be skeptical, you need to be you need to do a little self-criticism, you need to, as Teresa would say, be pretty humble. And I don't know, and Melvin, do you think that's right? I mean, I think that if philosophy is a methodology of criticism, in a way, self-analysis, and getting over the pernicious ignorance that we all seem to be too easily, we embrace too easily these days.
Yeah.
Somewhere I remember Angela Davis was before she was a political activist, was also a student of philosophy. And as I recall, her professor said she was one of the most brilliant students he had ever taught. So,
right.
Yeah.
I'll say this, when I was a kid growing up in Texas and knew nothing about the world, I mean, really, I'm the first person in my family to go to university. I saw a picture of her, and I think it was like Time magazine or something.
Right.
And it was about her being a philosopher, and I had no idea what philosophy is, but I remember thinking, I want to be like her.
Be like her. I just remember it was it Hegel? She studied Hegel, I believe, at the university in Germany. She went to Germany in graduate school.
I think that's
I remember trying to read Hegel, and I kept reading the same page over and over again. No, I'm not smart enough for this, so obviously. Let's see, we have a lot of students who are submitting questions about how philosophy can help us address the problem of fake news. Whatever that means. Depends, again, we're back to the history question, because those on the right say that the New York Times is fake news, and those on the left say that Fox is fake news. So I'm not quite sure what they mean by fake news. But how do we get at, this really gets back to truth, right? How do we use these feelings, and the rationality to arrive at what is our truth? What is true?
I mean, this is a pretty difficult question, because one of the things that philosophical inquiry partly turns on is the principle of openness. Now, how robustly that is in the person sitting in front of you, how weak it is, that's not the issue. The issue is that the principle of openness is held. And that principle of openness is partly what readies one for the possibility of being unsettled and sometimes unbeknownst. Right? One of the interesting things about the discourse of fake news is that the very invocation of the term implies that there's something real. That there is something out there that is real to be discovered. The moment we have that kind of structure, all of a sudden, we now can ask a series of questions. Well, what are the methods by which we arrive at the truth that one is aspiring toward? Are we making use, the ones who are claiming news are fake, right? That news is fake. Are we making use of the sort of processes of inquiry and critical evaluation, evidence and facts that are at the heart of arriving at the truth? And one of the things that we may come to discover is that when we push back against those who are claiming this or that is fake news, that they're actually not interested in engaging in those practices, that they're actually interested in something that is far more ideological, that is far more partisan. And in that respect, right, they're not really interested in a story about trying to get things right, right? And once we come to see that, then I think we need to use some other tools, because now philosophy has done its work, it has reached its end, and now we have to think about, well, what do we do in the context of people and folks who claim to be trying to arrive at the truth or getting things right, but who are really not interested in deploying the sort of best tools that philosophy has to offer to do that.
Yeah, I was thinking the other day, or actually I was walking this morning, and I was thinking about the Iroquois nation. And sort of this has nothing to do with philosophy. This is like just way out of left field in my brain. How their constitution was written, and the United States Constitution is based on parts of the Iroquois Constitution, and there are other sort of, we think of as oral, the Iroquois had a written language, but not a language that people who understood English could quite understand, and that constitution was transmitted to them orally from it, as I understand it. What role do oral traditions have in understanding this? This is actually a variation of a question submitted by Rashmi Bajari. Can you talk about that a bit? How do we consider? How do we broaden our concept?
For that, I mean, this is one of the things that some of us are really worrying about. And I mean, again, Melvin and I are very, very happy to be able to have this book series, and we want everyone who has a book on some, important figure who hasn't been discussed. We want to hear from them. But first, so the first thing for us to do is to get the books there. And it's also really, really important. In fact, there's some philosophers who are working on this and thinking about going and interviewing people around the world and talking and trying to understand something more about oral traditions. But even that often brings with it issues about translation and misunderstanding. But there's in fact, a former graduate student of mine, Justin Smith, is quite interested in that. He wants to. He's one of these people who just picks up languages like hats, but he wants to get a group of people together to go and sort of hear about these traditions. And surely a lot of people have a lot to contribute. But that's something that again, however important that is. We are, now focusing on the written word. And, one of the things that our book series is devoted to, like, for example, we have a translation. One of the things that we have coming up is a translation of 2 18th century Korean women who apparently were feminists of a rather radical sort, Neo-Confucian feminist. And that already is mind-blowing to me. Like, who knew, right? And we have someone who's thinking about working on the Aztecs, and he can apparently, or there are some texts he can read. The first book in our series published was on Mexican philosophy. And so we really want to broaden our scope, but yeah, there we go. There's
the series. So yeah.
Yeah. And Melvin, you might want to talk about what's in the works there, but the first books that came out were all women, except for the Mexican philosophy book, because they were already, people were already poised to write them. But the next set are African American thinkers.
Yeah, no. So, I sort of came on the series, it's a year and a half ago. And so, as it takes a little time to get book projects underway and to get them going. But we have a series of projects that are in various stages of development, a reissue of David Walker's Appeal, a reissue of Easton's treatise. Robert Gooding Williams, who's a professor of philosophy at Columbia there. He's doing work on Martin Delaney. I have a really compelling proposal on Marian Shad Carey. And not just simply, this was a woman who had an argument, a plea for immigration to Canada in the 19th century, but she had more to say beyond that, that relates to issues of feminism and work and the like. And then, of course, the sort of 20th century thinker Hubert Harrison, a kind of sort of radical Black thinker in the context or in the horizon of the 1920s and the Harlem Renaissance is a project that we're working on. So these are all in the works, and we're working on them. So you know, and if there are others, there are other folks that should be in this series. You know, Alexander Crummell, the Black nationalist, and Anna Julia Cooper. So there's a whole series of other folks that I want to get in this series. Some of this is about what Christia and I solicit, and others, you know, and the rest of this will be about what comes our way.
Okay. Christia, I wanted to give you a chance to talk about the course that you're offering at SPS.
Right, yeah. Speaking of suffering in the pandemic, yeah, so the Columbia asked some of us to create a special course for the summer program, and I decided it needed to be about suffering and loss because I was motivated by the pandemic issues. That was even before the murder of George Floyd. So it seems all the more relevant now. So my course is very much in keeping with some of the things that Melvin and I have been talking about. It's called Philosophical Reflections, I think it is, of love, loss, and human nature. And the focus is on ancient literature. I was partly motivated to do that because I think ancient literature kind of gets us outside ourselves. And June, you were nice enough to ask about my prison program. And one of the things that I insist on for those of us who teach in the program is that we mostly teach ancient literature because it's like other, you know, it really is kind of, it forces people not just to talk about themselves, but see humanity in its, in the ways in which it faces conflict and loss. So for example, one of the texts we're working on, we'll be reading, is the most ancient extant epics, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is about a god-man and a man-animal who battle with one another and then become best friends. It's very much about masculinity and about friendship and about loyalty, and just like blows people's minds. So my hope is to use that as a way of feeling the way to truth, in the sense, to kind of provoke conversations about crucial philosophical problems in the world and do some philosophy on them.
Oh, great. What are you, Melvin, how are you teaching up at Brown? I'm just curious. Are you guys in the lockdown as well?
Yeah, no. We're in the lockdown, and you know, we have to see what the fall will look like. It looks like we might be moving to. I know there's a lot of folks watching, so I don't know if this is yet. It looks like we may be moving to 3 semesters. So you know, I don't know what's going on. We'll see. But in the fall, I'm teaching a graduate course on W.B. Du Bois's social and political philosophy.
Cool. Wow. I was just sort of looking. I'm just trying to think. There's so much that we could be sort of thinking about as we sort of come to the close here. As you guys sort of think about sort of the role of philosophy, what does it contribute? I know we talked earlier about how we could use it in everyday life, but what does it actually contribute to our life in 2020? It almost feels like, you know, those of us who are doomed, those of us who don't know our history are doomed to repeat it. But how can we use some of how can we use some of what you've talked about tonight in our lives tomorrow?
Well, I think Melvin has given some really good examples of how relevant philosophy is to now.
Right.
You know, to understanding anger, to understanding, not so much understanding, but raising questions about.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I mean, the Socratic method, whatever you want to call it, but the process of, you know, you think you understand something, but let's think about it from a different perspective. Or I know, like one example that's really been moving to me recently is this kind of epistemological, this radical shift that some white people have made recently to say, oh my God, I thought I understood what systematic racism is, but I didn't. And then they, of course, lots of people are going to their Black friends or people, colleagues, and saying, well, tell me about it. And so yet again, Black people are supposed to like pull white people into, justice.
I'm just going to, anybody that asks me that is just going to get David Walker's appeal.
Yeah, exactly. You're like, slap her, you want to know about justice here. But one of the things, and then people say, well, okay, so tell your white friends to read these books, right? And you can read Du Bois, or you could, whatever it is. But I think really one of the things that moves, I would tell people is read Toni Morrison. Read books that help you feel your way to insight. So what the difference is between reading Toni Morrison, how that stands next to, I don't know, reading the new Jim Crow or something, that raises really good philosophical questions, right? What is the kind of knowledge that's being gained, and to what extent are we feeling our way to truth? I think Morrison helps us have insights into Black experience and into racism and into, ways of thinking about life that white people have just not experienced. And what does it mean not to experience something and still kind of come to understand? So all of those are philosophical questions. And if we don't ask the right questions, so philosophy in a philosophy course is often about what are the questions we should be asking about knowledge or truth or beauty or whatever it is. There are no answers. But that's the way philosophy can prepare us for the here and now, is just give us the right kind of questions to be asking ourselves.
I've been thinking as we've had this conversation of this, there's a French saying, la cœur a raison, raison ne connaît pas, the heart has reason that reason doesn't understand. And it seems somehow so appropriate for this conversation.
I mean, I would say as my final thought, I know we're wrapping up here, but, if we take the sort of recent murder of George Floyd, and we think about that video, we might ask people who watched the video, what did you see? Mm-hmm. Yes, you saw a man holding his knee on another man, but what did you see? Mm-hmm. Right? Because what's taking place is a cop holding his knee on a person as if he's not a person. Right. And then there's a question behind that. Well, what permits that kind of thing? What must the sort of norms, the habits, the ways of seeing folks, perceiving folks, what must the public philosophy of the community be such that this is permissible, or this is thought acceptable, or one thinks that one can do this and not be punished by it, right? And when we begin to sort of ask those kinds of questions, we immediately find ourselves in a realm of philosophy. Right.
Great. Wow,
and that's what it opens up for us.
Okay. Thank you. That's a wonderful place to stop, and I hope we all will consider that.
Thank you.
Consider all of the ideas that you both have put forth. We look forward to reading more of the Oxford series and seeing more of it. And good luck with your courses in the fall.
And June, thank you so much to you. I mean, a shout out to you and your work insofar as you're always rethinking narratives too.
I am. There's always.
You're doing philosophy, and sometimes maybe don't even know you're doing it.
I've never been trained, and often wished I had been trained.
Well, we so appreciate you. So thank you very much for doing that.
Okay. Well, thank you both. Have a good evening, and thank you everyone who joined us tonight. And take care.